The very large number of people who come in only because they smoked. And I think what makes this even sadder is the great majority of people who smoke wish they had not started.
A corporate manslaughter investigation has begun following the murders carried out by Lucy Letby. Police will look into the Countess of Chester Hospital where the neonatal nurse committed her crimes. A safeguarding review will begin following the death of 10-year-old Sarah Sharif in Woking. An investigation will look into all of the agencies involved, including police, social care and education. Sarah's father, Irfan Sharif, is among 3 people charged with her murder. And Spain, Portugal and Morocco will co-host the 2030 Men's World Cup. 3 opening matches will be held in South America to mark the tournament's centenary. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 57 points at 74.12. The pound buys $1.21 and €1.15. LBC weather, rain lingering in northern England and Northern Ireland tonight. Spells of rain also moving into the northwest with a low of 6 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 9:05 on LBC. I decided that we'd frankly had enough of Tory stuff over the last few days, so we're going to do something different in this hour and talk about the Green Party, because they've got their party conference in Brighton this weekend. So Adrian Ramsay, co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, is here with us. I always say of England and Wales because you are different from the Scottish Green Party, aren't you? Or you're a separate organisation. But do you agree with them on everything, or do you have a few policies that are a bit different?
I think if you looked at the manifestos, you'd find it almost exactly the same. But yes, we are separate organisations. And of course, the Scottish Green Party is part of the government in Scotland.
It is,
so we're
indeed
always keen to promote their achievements.
Well, Adrian is going to take calls a little bit later in the hour, 0345 6060 973, if you'd like to put a question to him. I've already got a text question and a couple of calls coming in, so do keep those coming. But let's start off with talking about what's happened today at the Tory Party conference. Let's start off with HS2, because I always thought that HS2 would be a thing that Greens would probably support, because you would want to promote railway travel over road travel, but you've been against HS2. Why?
So yes, we have opposed this particular project, not just the Green Party, but the wider environmental movement. If you look at what the conservation organisations have said and lots of other campaigners, we have highlighted the huge cost that we knew it would incur and predicted, sadly rightly, that it would well exceed the projected costs. But also there have been deep concerns about the environmental damage that would be caused, particularly in the London to Birmingham leg, which it now transpires is probably going to be the only leg that gets built. So we could well have the worst of both worlds. What we've argued for from the beginning is that the investment that was proposed for HS2 would be far better spent if put into regional and local rail networks.
So 3 cheers for Rishi Sunak, eh?
Well, he has said that today, but I'd make 2 points about that. One is this is well over a decade after we were saying that. So, the north of England in particular and the regions could have benefited from that investment. And I think any of us who live in the regions around England know that we've had underinvestment in our rail and public transport infrastructure. So there's been huge delays. But also, if you look at the detail of what the Prime Minister said today, yes, that was his headline about that local rail investment. But actually, he's looking at spreading that across the whole country, so not focused on the north of England. And for a lot of that funding to go into road building. And actually, we need to be focusing that investment on rail, on bus services, on schemes that make it safer for people to walk and cycle, measures that help us to take the shift away from such high levels of car usage and for people to be able to benefit as we move towards a decarbonised transport system.
Would you not at least be able to say that, well, actually, in the last 13 years, this government has spent far more money than any previous governments on sort of cycling schemes and the kind of things that you've just been talking about? You would obviously want them to spend more and put more resources into it. I get that. But actually, they've probably done a much better job than you would have thought so 13 years ago.
Well, if I listen to what Green councillors and residents tell me around the country, and including in East Anglia, where I'm based, they highlight the lack of adequate infrastructure for people walking and cycling, and in terms of keeping our roads safe. And in fact, in Norfolk and Suffolk, we've had several really worrying, fatal traffic collisions where cyclists have died in several different places in the area in the last few weeks alone. And Rishi Sunak's proposal to make it harder for communities to argue for lower speed limits in areas where there are safety or indeed air quality issues is only going to increase those public health and public safety concerns.
How are his proposals going to make it harder for local communities to do that?
Well, he said that he wants to make it harder for communities to have 20 miles an hour speed limits if that's what they want.
He said was he wants to sort of abolish any sort of blanket 20 mile an hour speed limit in sort of a particular area, which I think most people would think was sensible. Most people would agree with 20 mile an hour speed limits outside schools or maybe at other institutions as well, but not everywhere.
Well, I think it's about communities having the ability to argue for lower speed limits where we have got real issues in terms of either road safety problems or indeed air quality issues, which are a growing issue in our
they can do that
towns
now.
and cities.
I think the problem was in Wales, where they've just had I know people in Wales, in the Labour Party in Wales, object to this idea of a blanket ban, but effectively it is. I mean, it's in all built-up areas.
Well, there's a strong evidence base that if you have a lower speed limit in built-up areas, then it improves road safety, and it's very clear that
Cut it to 10, then.
The difference between there being a collision at 20 miles an hour and there being a collision at 30 miles an hour in terms of the likelihood that someone's going to be seriously injured or die is much lower, and that's the bottom line. That, along with the air quality measures that Rishi Sunak's been opposing and trying to make into a political football, these things are about saving people's lives. So we shouldn't be playing politics with this. The government is trying to turn all sorts of core issues. Is
it playing politics to argue against a policy that you think will actually not improve things and affect a lot of people detrimentally? I mean, the ULEZ zone in London, I mean, I think you're probably right if you're going to say, well, they've used the Uxbridge by-election result as a reason to sort of adjust their policies on net zero. But I mean, it clearly was going, or is affecting a lot of people in a detrimental way, and it's quite reasonable, surely, for one political party to point that out.
Well, I think that the Conservatives have misread what the Uxbridge by-election result means. What the Green Party's argued in supporting air quality measures is that there needs to be proper provision in place, so that if you're part of the 1 in 10 people whose existing vehicles don't meet the requirements of ULEZ, actually 9 in 10 vehicles do, but if you're part of the 1 in 10 that don't, there should have been a proper scrappage scheme in place earlier, and that was something that elected Greens have argued all the way along. So there is something about these schemes being done in the right way, but I just question whether the motivation is what it should be from the government when you've seen these attacks on net zero, attacks on refugees, trying to politicise issues around the environment, around air quality, around safety, around the idea that people should be able to have access to local shops and services in their local community. The sorts of things they're going to desperate lengths to politicise, I think, just shows how they've run out of ideas, and they're not willing to defend their own record. They're just trying to go for these sort of gimmicky announcements like we saw in some of the Prime Minister's speech today.
Well, I'm sure we'll get some calls on that subject, so we'll leave that for the moment. What about the other big announcement today about the effective smoking ban? It seems to have worked in New Zealand. What's the Green attitude to that?
Well, it was interesting, and I think this is an example of the Prime Minister perhaps scrambling around for how he could make headlines from his speech.
Harish, they thought that you should do that in your leader's speech at the Green Party conference.
Well, we will be putting forward carefully worked out and costed proposals that are consistent with the arguments we've been making over some time. This seems to have come out of nowhere today. Of course, it does seek to address an important issue. The bit that hasn't got so much attention is around vapes, where there was something as part of the announcement around restricting the availability of vapes to children. I'd like to see the detail of what's proposed with that, because I think the government should be banning disposable vapes and vapes that are particularly targeted at children, because we have seen under this government a big rise in the number of younger people who've become over-dependent on cigarette substitutes, and that's both a health issue and an environmental issue. So I do think that I'd like to see the detail of what's proposed there, which I think will come out in the coming days. In terms of smoking, of course, smoking remains a major public health issue. I supported the proposal to not allow smoking in enclosed public spaces when that was proposed. It was quite controversial at the time, but I don't think many people would argue going back on that now as an important public health measure. I think we could look at extending that to certain public outdoor areas where there's lots of people, particularly lots of younger people around, like outdoor parts of youth centres, playgrounds, etc. But in terms of whether to eventually ban smoking by continually increasing the age at which people can buy cigarettes, I think we have to question whether that's going to work.
If it's worked out, presumably one of the reasons they've done this is because they've seen that it worked has worked in New Zealand. I think that some US states have tried it as well. So, what's not to like about saving a quarter of cancer deaths or lives that happen at the moment?
Well, I agree that smoking is a major public health issue, and there's far more that can and should be done to highlight the health impacts of it. There's policies that the Green Party's been proposing for some time around banning advertising of cigarettes, forcing plain packaging, for example. Certainly everything needs to be done to move away from the glamorisation of smoking that is less common than it used to be.
But if we believe that smoking is so dangerous, and it clearly is, all the medical evidence points to that, why wouldn't we want to ban it?
I think it's a question of calmly studying whether that would actually work, because what you can sometimes see, and obviously the periods of prohibition of alcohol in the US are often quoted in this respect, is if you just ban something, can it end up going on the black market and you don't actually end up banning it, and in fact you then have less control over where and how it's sold and whether it has the substances in it that it's claimed to have and so on. So I think there's a very practical argument around the effectiveness, but certainly I agree with tobacco and with drugs in general, a public health approach of how you can minimise the health impacts on people should be the motivation behind the policy, and then it's about the evidence.
But actually, that's been really successful, hasn't it? If you look at the figures of particularly teenagers taking up smoking over the last 20 or 30 years, it's gone down from about 30% to 3%, and that. Whoever's done it, whether it's partly the Labour government, partly the Tory government, that's been a public health success.
Undoubtedly. And I think the banning of smoking in enclosed public places has been a big part of that, because it's just reduced the normalisation of smoking.
I was totally against that, even though I hate cigarette smoking, but I think I was proved wrong.
Yeah, it was very controversial at the time. I clearly supported it at the time. There were lots of debates in politics, but I think it has proven to be a visionary measure that has shifted the culture.
What about banning meat?
I don't think you can. I don't think you can ban meat. I think that there's a valid debate to have about our food system in a wider sense, in terms of what does the food system need to look like in ways that we are managing our land so that there's more space for nature, so that farmers get the funding that they need to manage land in ways that are good for wildlife. There's nowhere near enough funding going in to that, and to ensure that we are upholding and improving animal welfare standards. And yes, there is a question around the balance of different foods. Some foods have a far bigger impact on the environment than others. And are we putting the right resources in the right places to support farmers to produce more foods that have a lower environmental impact? And, we could be producing a much greater variety of particularly grains and different types of crops that move away from the monocrop system, reduce our carbon and water and impact, but also are good for farmers, because the farmers I speak to say the current schemes that the government's been developing for subsidies to help them manage their land in ways that
we've actually got a question.
They've not had anywhere near.
We've actually got a question on this, but looking at the time, we'll do it after the break. It's 18 minutes past 9.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
9:20. We are streaming this, by the way, if you want to watch us live. Adrian Ramsay is the co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales and is taking your call, is about to take your calls. I was going to talk to him a little bit more about a few other things first, but there's a lot of calls coming in. And here's a text question from Will in Crediton. Is it Green Party policy to implement a meat tax? When you appeared on the show last week, you called for a move to less intensive farming systems. But do you not appreciate that this would lead to a reduction in productivity and that farming has become more intense to supplement cheap food and reduce land usage? Reducing our own food production will increase imports of more carbon-intensive food. How is that good for the climate? Now, there's a lot of logic in that, isn't there?
There's a lot of good points there, and of course these issues are all interconnected. What we were talking about when we spoke last week was the State of Nature report, which shows that Britain is one of the most nature-depleted countries on Earth, and the reports from 60 UK environmental charities highlighted that there's two key reasons for that. One is climate change, and the other is intensive forms of farming. And looking at the details of what the Nature 2030 charities are rightly highlighting, we can see that only 20% of farmland is on the high-level agri-environmental schemes, really benefiting from the levels of financial support to manage land in a way that's good for nature. That's nowhere near good enough. There's not the right level or overall pot of funding going into that, and that's, I think, what farmers really want. And we need to be promoting forms of farming that are both good for nature and good for food production. And there's plenty of examples of that, including in my neck of the woods in East Anglia, where we've got several exemplar farms promoting different forms of regenerative farming or agroforestry. And we do need to see far more of that. And we also need to be widening and increasing the range of different crops that we are growing at home. Absolutely, that's a really important part of the question. But that's just not the way that our farming system is set up at the moment, with giving priority to really intensive forms of farming. And related to that, if you are allocating large amounts of land to animal farming, and then you need to also grow the crops to feed to the animals, it undoubtedly takes up far more land than if you have a higher proportion of the food you're producing coming directly from crops. So there is a question about the overall mix of food, but it's also about working with farmers who, from my discussions with them all the time, and in fact I'm meeting the NFU in a few weeks' time, they want to get the financial support to manage land in ways that's good for wildlife and nature, given that our food system depends on that, as well as to be maintaining and increasing the levels of food production we're doing at home.
So what about his first point? Is it Green Party policy to implement a meat tax?
Well, not as far as I'm aware. I mean, we have got policies that are about recognising that we need to have a shift towards a higher amount of plant-based foods in our diet. Now, that's not about banning meat. That's about saying what's the mix that we need to have. And, I'm not alone in saying that. Government public health organisations talk about the range of foods you need to have in your diet to be healthy and to protect the environment. So that this is quite a mainstream issue these days, but the government's not reflecting that in its environmental policies.
But if you're going to encourage people to move to more plant-based diets, I mean, the tax system is one way of doing it, isn't it?
It could be, but I think it's not as simple as that, because at the moment we have far too many people who simply can't afford to get access to healthy, nutritious food at all. And, for example, I visited the food bank in Waveney Valley a few months ago, and like food banks across the country, what they told me is that they've seen a major increase in the number of people who are relying on those food banks in recent months and during and since the pandemic. So there's also an issue around how do we get nutritional food available to everybody, and we're just so far away from doing that, as so many recent campaigns have shown.
Another text question from Joe, who says, now that HS2 has been scrapped, are the Green Party looking forward to opposing the 80 new road schemes the government have proposed to replace it? I'm not sure it's replacing it as such, but I mean, there will be. I mean, do you take just as a supplement to that? Do you take the position that actually we shouldn't be investing any more money in roads ever?
I'm not sure I would put it as extremely as that, but what I would say is that the government already had a £27 billion road building programme before the extra money announced for roads in the Prime Minister's speech today.
Over what period?
That's capital expenditure for new roads. It's not an ongoing revenue spend as far as I'm aware. So that's a huge amount of money, and it's just about not getting the priorities right. If you look at our rail infrastructure, particularly for routes that go cross-country, it's extremely poor, and our regions around the country, and in particular in the north of England, really suffer from that. Local bus services we see have been cut right back, and in fact in rural communities we often see that villages don't have a bus service at all now, or it's extremely limited. So we've seen government short-term policies around things like the £2 bus fare, which isn't much good if you haven't actually got a bus service. But we need long-term investment in both bus services and rail, and I've been arguing for that from the beginning, and that the government putting this amount of money into road building programmes, which today's announcement has increased, is just not getting their priorities right.
The problem is about bus services in rural areas. I mean, where I live in North Norfolk, you do see buses, but they've very rarely got many people on them. And so the natural thing is if you're running a local council and you've got X amount of pounds to spend on your transport budget, of which bus services are part, but then you find that people aren't using them, the natural thing is to do, okay, well, if they're not using them, let's cut those and we'll spend it better elsewhere. And that, I have a real sympathy with council politicians on these sorts of things, because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, when there's only a certain pot of money to go around.
Well, council budgets have become severely stretched under this government, as we know, with cutbacks to local authorities. But it is about the model for how public transport is run. We've had a failed policy of bus services being run in private hands and without properly public accountability, except in places like London, where the bus services are much better and have been under more direct public control for a longer period. That's the sort of model that we need to be moving back to, in my view, away from
you've
bus.
got the intensity of population in London. You haven't got that in rural areas, have you?
That's right. And obviously you're not going to have the same frequency of a bus going to a Norfolk village as you have around different stops in London. But in some places there's no bus at all. And it is about social inclusion as well as about the environment. So you can't just look at the pure numbers of people using the service. And of course people need to know the service is there and be able to rely on that for the usage to increase.
Well, that's the interesting point, is that we have a saying amongst, obviously, presenters. I mean, sometimes if you're doing a difficult subject and you're thinking, well, are we going to get any phone calls on this? James O'Brien says this a lot, if you build it, they will come. And they do. And it's a bit the same in bus services. If the bus services aren't there, obviously no one can use them. But people have got to get used to the idea that they're there and are reliable and they're clean and they're relatively they're not speedy, but reliable. Then people might use them more. But if they're only coming once a day, and that isn't the time that you want one, then if you're where I live and you want to go into Norwich on the bus, but there's only one bus back at a time that you don't want to come back, it's a simple thing, isn't it? You're not going to use it.
I think that's right, and I think that applies to transport policies more generally, because if you look at the cities and countries around the world that have succeeded in really changing the transport system so that you have a critical mass of people using bikes or using buses or using trains, that has been about a long-term systematic investment in those services and all of the safety and public support measures that need to go into helping people make those changes. So it has to be a long-term policy, and I don't think we've ever had that in the UK.
Lots of text questions coming in, lots of calls as well, but we'd welcome more, because we're going to devote the next half an hour to calls and texts. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. A very cruel question here from Taz, who says, can you please ask the gentleman why the Green Party is so out of touch and useless? That's not very nice, is it?
Well, that's quite strongly worded. I'd have to have a chat to Taz to understand.
Taz, call in and tell us what you mean by
question.
that.
What I would point to is that there's been we've more than quadrupled the number of green councillors around the country since early 2019. So, that...
Which is an achievement, but it's still... Well, what's the total number?
It's about 750.
And how many councillors are there altogether? About...
I couldn't tell you exactly, but I mean, I take your point. But in terms of the trajectory of Green support, not just in council numbers, but in terms of the number of local authorities where we're part of the administration, now getting on for 40, the Green influence in local government right across the country is now very significant. And
that only works if you actually run good councils. And I mean, the nearest Green council to me in Brighton, I mean, in some ways, over the years, it's been an absolute disaster.
Well, I could point to all the achievements of the councillors in Brighton and Hove in terms of improving youth services, in terms of supporting people through the COVID pandemic, in terms of improvements to public transport, retrofitting people's homes and so on. There's lots of achievements to highlight there. But we've now got Green councillors right across the country, so you can look at all sorts of examples of the impact that we're having. And it's about working constructively with other parties to really influence local decisions that are made for the benefit of...
Are you in any administrations with Conservatives?
Not that I'm aware of. Certainly not only with the Conservatives.
OK, right. We'll hear more from Adrian in just a moment. He's co-leader of the Green Party. The number to call if you'd like to put a question to him, 0345 6060 973. It's 9:32 on LBC. Let's get the latest news headlines from Daryl Jackson.
Rishi Sunak insists hundreds of transport schemes will be funded instead after confirming he's cancelling the northern leg of HS2. Former Prime Minister David Cameron's criticised the announcement, though. Families of Lucy Letby's victims say they're reassured police are opening a corporate manslaughter investigation at the hospital where the nurse worked. It'll look into senior management decisions during the period she murdered 7 babies at the Countess of Chester Hospital. And the rapper Stormzy has joined thousands of people at a candlelit vigil for a 15-year-old stabbing victim, Eliane Andam, in Croydon. Wearing white, they gathered to pay respects to the teenager at the same spot where she was killed a week ago. LBC weather: rain lingering in northern England and Northern Ireland tonight. Spells of rain also moving into the northwest with a low of 6 degrees.
All day Friday, we'll be taking some time out to raise money for LBC's charity Global's Make Some Noise. This year, we'll be working with the people from read.co.uk to make this year even bigger and better because they're doubling your donations. When you donate online this week through the Big Give platform, read.co.uk will match those donations up to an incredible £175,000. That amount is guaranteed thanks to Read. Visit lbc.co.uk for T's and C's and to donate. I'm Iain Dale, you're listening to LBC, and it's 9:33.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
9:36. Richard says, I recently joined the Liberal Democrats, and when I asked them why not the Greens or Labour, they told me that the Greens have a policy of wanting no pets in homes. Is this true, and if so, why?
No, that's
You're looking perplexed.
That's not true, and I have a rescued cat myself.
Well, I hope you're reassured by that. Maybe Liberal Democrats sometimes they don't have to play dirty, don't they?
Well, some of the some of the odd things you sometimes see in Lib Dem leaflets are, give people a bit of a chuckle, don't they?
Yeah, more than that sometimes. Right, let's go to your calls. We have Adrian Ramsay with us, co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. Hassan's in Westminster. Hello, Hassan.
Hello. Hi, Adrian. I've been very impressed by Green Party positions on taxation, on NHS and school meals, especially since Starmer has abandoned a lot of these progressive causes. Have you thought of inviting Jeremy Corbyn and the left wing of the Labour Party into the Green Party? That would double your MPs, triple your membership and quadruple your vote share in the general election.
Thank you for that question, Hassan. And you're absolutely right. The Green Party has progressive policies across the board, and that includes our willingness to say that the very wealthiest in society, the multi-millionaires, the billionaires, should be asked to pay even modestly more in taxation, even at, say, a 1% tax on those with assets of, say, over £10 million would make a huge difference, billions of pounds of difference in terms of the money we have available to fund the NHS, to ensure that children have access to school meals throughout primary school, to quote the examples you've given, Hassan. So people are very much coming to the Green Party, yes, because of our environmental policies and also because of our social policies for a fairer future and for funding in public services and recognising the links between environmental and social issues as well. So very much support your sentiment. In terms of your particular question, we have people joining the Green Party from all different backgrounds. That definitely includes people who have been in the Labour Party and who feel that the Labour Party is not offering an adequate opposition and is indeed let people down by its backtracking on many social and environmental policies. And we also have people joining the Green Party who've come from other political backgrounds or who've not been in politics at all in the past but want to support getting more Green MPs elected so that we can hold the other party's feet to the fire and really make a difference on the debates and the decisions in the next Parliament. So, Hassan, if you support Green Party policies, do come and join us. It sounds like you're really supportive of what we're arguing for, and thank you for your comments.
Would you welcome Jeremy Corbyn into the Green Party if he so desired?
Well, we've been asked that question before. I've not got any reason to think that's something that he's considering. We have a process where if there's an elected politician who's not from the Green Party who wants to join us, whether they're a councillor, which does happen reasonably often, or an MP, then we have a process within the party to consider the implications of that, the pros and cons, how the relationship would be managed with that individual, whether they're willing to sign up to all of our values. And so we would go through that process with Jeremy Corbyn as we would for anyone else. But I'm not expecting it.
Of course, Rishi Sunak yesterday said that the way was open for Nigel Farage to rejoin the Conservative Party, but
I think
you don't seem quite as keen on Jeremy Corbyn as he might be on Nigel Farage.
I think you can see that the way that Nigel Farage has had a huge impact on where the Conservative Party is at now. It's just drifted so far from, even those of us who were deeply concerned about all sorts of things that were done under the coalition government in terms of cuts to public services and so on. It has drifted so far even from those days. And, seeing Nigel Farage dancing with Priti Patel at Conservative Party conference, it just reinforced how low the Conservatives have gone and why they're so desperately trying to whip up culture wars and political footballs over things like net zero and decarbonisation and refugees. And it's just a deeply irresponsible form of politics.
Let's go to a text question from David in Tufnell Park. How can the Green Party ever make a difference at Westminster with only 3 parliamentarians, 1 MP and 2 members of the House of Lords? Of course, Caroline Lucas is standing down, with former leader Sian Berry selected to run in her seat at Brighton Pavilion, and you've got Natalie Bennett and Jenny Jones in the Lords. Now, all 3 of those often on this programme. But if you don't make headway at the next election, I mean, it's quite difficult for the Green Party to think, well, is there a future, isn't it?
Well, there's 2 answers that I would give to David's question. First of all, to highlight the impact that we do have with our representatives in Parliament. You can look at examples even from recent weeks where Greens led the opposition to government proposals to weaken regulations around water companies. They were proposing
the Liberal Democrats say it's them.
Well, I think if you speak to the average member of the House of Lords, they would say very clearly that Jenny Jones led that campaign. Equally, she led the campaign where we were in opposition to the clamping down to the right to protest. And if you also look at the impact that Caroline Lucas has had as an MP, where she's multiple times won Parliamentarian of the Year awards. Last week, she won an award for her impact in campaigning to protect nature. The influence she's had on the political debate within Parliament and in the country more widely is enormous. And we have a huge opportunity to build on that legacy. And to answer your question directly, Ian, we have seen a huge increase in Green Party support right around the country in recent years. We're going into this general election on a fantastic basis for winning a group of Green MPs in Parliament, and that will make such a big difference in holding the other parties' feet to the fire, both on the environment and in creating a fairer society.
Now, for some reason, I've got lots of calls on the board, but none of them are coming through, so I'm going to continue with another text question from Brian in Edinburgh. Do the England and Wales Greens support the Scottish Greens on the matter of Scottish independence? No wriggling, non-committal answers, please. Scottish independence is a matter for all of the UK, so they must have a position on it.
Well, the very first question you asked me this night, Ian, was, are the Scottish Greens a separate organisation to the Green Party of England and Wales? And the answer is yes.
Why those? We're United Kingdom.
It was a decision that was taken in 1990, so a little bit before I came into politics. I think it was because Greens recognised the principle of subsidiarity, that decisions should be taken at the lowest possible level, nearest to the communities and areas of the globe that are affected by them. That's a general principle. And we also believe in the right to self-determination. We would apply that to any country or principality or region in the globe, and that includes Scotland. Scotland has a right to decide its own future. And so it's not really for me to dictate what the Scottish Green Party's position should be.
Well, nobody's asking you to dictate.
No.
But given that you have a view on whether Britain should be in the EU or not, I don't see it as unreasonable to ask if you think Scotland should be in the UK.
Well, whether Britain is in the EU is something that directly affects England and Wales. It affects whether England and Wales is in the EU as well, doesn't it? So it is about the Green Party of England and Wales position. Our position is that it is a matter for the Scottish people to decide. So, we're quite relaxed about there being another referendum, if that's the will of the Scottish Parliament. And then there'll need to be a debate on its merits, and the Scottish Greens will
You're the leader of a political party. I think everyone's got a right to know what if you can't speak for the whole party on this, what's your personal view?
Well, if I'm really honest, I have mixed feelings about it personally. I've always considered myself to be British rather than English. I've got family roots in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. My surname is Scottish. I've lived and worked in Wales, so I identify with the United Kingdom as a whole. At the same time, and knowing people who live in Scotland, I can understand why they've repeatedly got a government in Westminster that they haven't voted for, and that's caused untold damage to Scotland as well as to the rest of the UK. And that's why there's lots of people in Scotland that want a system where Scotland has more control over its own destiny. So on a personal level, I feel somewhat torn, but it's not my decision to make. It's the Scottish Greens' decision.
Brian's just texted again. He's wriggling it, and he says... OK, right, let's. There's no debate on this at your party conference then this weekend, as far as
there is not, no.
Right, OK, let's go to Steve in Nottingham. Steve, hello.
Oh, hi, Ian. My question is it still Green Party policy to legalise cannabis?
Hi, Steve. Yes, it is. And our position on drugs, as I was outlining earlier on when we were speaking about the smoking ban, is what's the best way to minimise any negative impacts on people's health? What's the best public health approach in relation to drugs? And with cannabis, there's a lot of evidence that the war on drugs hasn't worked, that cannabis being supplied by drug dealers can result in people not having confidence about what's in that drug. And if it was regulated, then there could be far more control over that. And it's about looking at what's the impact of different policies, what policies best work, and that's the position that we would take in relation to cannabis.
Are you happy with that answer, Steve?
I'm delighted with that answer. That's absolutely great. Thank you.
Well, we like to oblige. Happy customer. Grace is in Ealing. Hello, Grace.
Hi. The thing that continues to frustrate and annoy me most is that there is so little concern in our politics and in our debate on social media and everything else about the world's poorest people. And so far as I understand, the Green Party wants to increase overseas aid to 1% of GDP, yes, which I think is fantastic, obviously. But there are other things going on as well. I mean, the aid money that goes from the developed world to the developing world is far, far less than the money going in the opposite direction. We're still actually taking much more money out of the developing world than we are giving them in aid because of banks creating unjust loans and exploitation of people, all sorts of things. So I really want politicians to deal with those issues also, as well as restoring aid, and for aid to be spent better, because sometimes it's not spent well and it needs to be monitored carefully and spent as well as possible. But it just bemuses me that we talk so little about people in severe poverty who obviously are most likely to be seriously impacted by climate change, who are in poverty largely because of things that made our country rich. And people on the left are rightly concerned about refugees and yet talk very, very little about people who are still stuck in severe poverty and who are sometimes working laboriously for the things that we buy, including our smartphones and our chocolate. So what would the Green Party do to raise awareness of the people in our world who really need support and who are suffering because of things that we benefit from?
Adrian, hold that thought, because I've just looked at the time and I've realised I've missed the break, so we need to do that first. It's 9:48.
Coming up at 10 on LBC, Ben Kentish.
Rishi Sunak says he and the Conservatives are the change that Britain needs. But does the Prime Minister represent change at all, or just more of the same?
Ben Kentish on LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
Adrian Ramsay is with us, co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. Right, text question from Steve. Is it right that the Conservatives, Lib Dems and Labour get full conference live streams, but smaller parties such as the Greens and others get little or no coverage? Why are we not permitted to see what else is on offer? Now, both the Greens and Plaid Cymru are holding their conferences at the end of this week. Plaid's conference is being held in Aberystwyth, and the SNP's conference starts in 11 days' time in Aberdeen. I don't think any longer that the BBC Parliament does a live stream of the main party conferences, and I'm pretty sure they aren't going to do for yours either, but presumably you stream it live on your website.
Well, we certainly have significant parts of the conference that we promote publicly, including the leaders' speeches and the panel debates that we'll be running on topical issues with different speakers. We also have a hybrid conference, so that for those members where it's more convenient for them to join online, they can do so. So that's about increasing the accessibility to our members. But more generally, we have a lot more media coverage of our conferences than we used to, which reflects the growth in support for the Green Party. But of course, we'd always welcome more if people want to come and cover more of our discussions.
So if people want to watch it on the website, what's the website address?
I think if you look at the main Green Party webpage, greenparty.org.uk, there'll be updates throughout the weekend, including of the leader speeches and panel sessions. We don't stream all of the internal discussions. I'm not promising that, but there will be parts of the conference that are made available, including our speech on Friday.
Right, Grace. Oh no, we were talking to Grace in Ealing, and she was asking about international development aid. Do you want to just answer, Grace?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad to hear that question, Grace, because the fact that the Green Party looks at issues of inequality on a global basis is one of the things that prompted me to join the party as a teenager, and it still remains absolutely critical to our values. And you've highlighted a number of the ways in which our economy, as one of the richest countries in the world, has an impact on the plight of some of the poorest people in the world. Clearly in relation to climate change, where people in the global south are already feeling the biggest impacts and will continue to do so, but also in relation to the trade system. So on climate change, we have always argued that there need to be significant payments from the richer countries in the world that help the poorer countries to both adapt to the impacts of climate change, but also to transition to a greener economy. And the promises that are often made from our government and others about the level of support, financial support, that should go into that are frequently broken, and our government is well behind its own promises in relation to that, as well as having reduced the aid budgets, as you said, Grace. And then secondly, on the trade system, there's been a lot of awareness over the last couple of decades of the idea of fair trade in relation to certain foodstuffs, the idea of people paying a fair price for foods that they might buy that come from poorer countries in the world. But we don't have that same thing for consumer goods, do we? And you mentioned mobile phones, we don't have it for clothes. And so there's far more that I think could be done for fair trade type labels on more things, and to change the tax system in a way that ensures that we are prioritising and supporting goods that are produced in an ethical way. And there's so many types of poverty and environmental impact of our economy that just go completely under the radar at the moment, and I'm really pleased you've highlighted these issues.
Grace, thank you very much for your question. Something new into us at LBC. Activists from Just Stop Oil have just disrupted a West End performance of Les Miserables. Does Adrian support their demonstration?
Well, that's the first I've heard of that particular demonstration.
First I've heard of it too.
More generally, what I would say is that I would distinguish between supporting the right to protest, which is important in a democratic society, and there are real dangers, as we've seen in other countries of the world, in clamping down on that. And then on the other hand, protesters need to review whether the particular tactics they're using are achieving their own goals. What I would say, though, most importantly, is if you look at the message of Just Stop Oil or of other campaigning groups, then clearly the message is as important as ever, in the sense that the government has just announced the Rosebank oil field.
We know all that, but how on earth can they justify disrupting a performance in a theatre? I mean, I don't know how a performance in a theatre can affect oil production in any way at all. I mean, I don't know whether there's been sponsorship from an oil company, but even so, you're disrupting the enjoyment of probably 1,500 people who've paid £50, £100 for their tickets. I mean, how can that be justified?
Well, look, I don't speak for Just Stop Oil.
No, you don't. But therefore, you can have a view. You can have a view, and you can condemn it if you want to.
Well, I've only just heard about it as you have done. I don't know what the link is, whether there's a link around sponsorship or whatever. All I would say is that it's for individual organisations to review whether their tactics are achieving their ends. My job as a politician...
It sounds to me as if you think they're not achieving those goals.
Well, this has only just happened, and we will see. But my role is to highlight the political solutions that are needed to address these issues and to challenge the government over decisions like the new Rosebank oil field, which we opposed, and to argue for the alternatives of supporting renewable energy.
Let's run through a few quick texts before we finish. Somebody says here, can you tell the Green Party representative he's won my vote? Labour and the Tories have lost their way. I agree with everything that he's said. Rishi and Longhurst says it's so refreshing to hear a politician with a sound drugs policy without all the namby-pambyism of other parties. Apparently, the party conferences have been streamed in full on the BBC iPlayer, so I don't know whether they're going to be doing that for the Greens or not. Switch on Saturday, I suppose. And Tanim says, I've recently travelled to Brighton, and the way the Green Party's destroyed that city, I hope and pray they never win that seat ever again. And Michael says, does the Green Party want road pricing in the UK? Yes or no? Because we've got 20 seconds left.
Road pricing as in tolls?
No, price per mileage. So if I go to Manchester, I have to pay per mile.
That's not something that I'm promoting. I want to promote better public transport.
Thank you very much indeed, Adrian. Enjoy your conference, and you get 2 leader speeches at the Green Party conference. Better value for money, I guess.
One joint one.
Oh, you do it together, do you?
Yeah, we will be.
That must be interesting writing. Now, thanks for all of your calls and messages this evening. I'll be back tomorrow from 7. I'll be joined by on our Thursday night phone-in by the former Conservative MP and Cabinet Minister David Gauke, who's put together a new book about the future of the political centre-right. Coming up at 1 on LBC, it's Richard Spur. But first, here's Ben Kentish.
Ian, thank you very much indeed. And we must thank the Teddington Services Burger King for fuelling both of our shows tonight. Hello, good evening at 10 o'clock.
Be in no doubt, it is time for a change, and we are